Hi, good morning to everyone. I will give a short presentation on Portugal, what's happening in Portugal. I will cover everything that's I think it's relevant for most of you. The context where everything happened and why in Portugal. Then I'll move to cultivation and production, then the medical market, the hemp and CBD, and then a brief note on what's happening or what may happen in terms of adult use in Portugal, since we have news since last week. So that's the interrupt me, or then we have a roundtable if you prefer. So Portugal is very connected to medical cannabis. In 1563, Garcia da Horta, Portuguese doctor, went to India, a Sephardic Jewish doctor living in Portugal and born there. He moved to India and he wrote a book that became probably the first description of many drugs in the West, at least of cannabis, hemp. Bang as a drink, and then the book was originally written in Portuguese, and it was translated into Latin, then English. So for many centuries, he became one of the most used medicine books in the West, describing and advocating in some ways that plants in general that were used in the East should be brought and should be taken seriously, included in what we can now call the European pharmacopoeias. Very interesting, and he in Portugal. He is a very famous person. It's not like an obscure character. He was in banknotes and stamps. Many hospitals and schools, public schools and public hospitals are named after him. So it's not a minor character of Portuguese scientific history. And one interesting thing is that he, for the first time, he described what we can call a trip. So he described that when Portuguese sailors were missing their families in Portugal, they would drink bang and then travel back home in their dreams and meet their families. So it's probably the first description of a trip in a scientific book, at least in the West. The Portuguese cannabis laws have the common and global origin that all the laws of other countries of most nations have. They have origin in the Opium Conventions and then in the United Nations treaties. That's the context for everything. Portugal was an early adopter of the original Opium Convention's laws, and therefore since 1926 in Portugal, we have in the laws the possibility of prescription of medical cannabis. So many countries still have these laws that they don't know they have. Portugal is one case. So we adopted the first acts, and then we introduced the possibility of prescribing what was then called Indian hemp to patients. There is no research on if that was routinely done or not, how much prescriptions, how much patients. It's not something that at least I could for now get hold of. I know some researchers are trying to research that. In other countries it's much more research, in Netherlands, in the UK, I know that. But at least it was in the law. And then in 1970, Portugal was still not a democracy, was a dictatorship. The law was amended in 1970 to introduce the possibility of cultivation of cannabis for medicinal purposes. I also don't know why this amendment was made in the law. I've heard many theories, but I don't know for sure, but it was. So there was an explicit provision in 1970 that the law would be amended for the cultivation of cannabis. So for context, what I find more relevant is that Portugal is a small open economy with liberal drug policies. This is the three things that investors have to understand. First, that's small, it's not big. So domestic market will always be small. But it's very open. You don't need Portuguese partners to open companies in Portugal. You don't need local partners in terms of law nor de facto. It's a country with a very open economy to foreign investment, EU investment or non-EU. We don't discriminate. There's no prejudice 20 nation or 20 kind of money, of course, provided that all the ultimate beneficiary and money laundering rules are in place, which is, of course, very good for the structure of the economy. And we had also, I think this is relevant, we had, let's say, a bad experience with opium. So Portugal tried to, when was the opium rush in 2010, when Tasmania and Spain were not delivering all the opium the world, illicit opium the world needed. Portugal tried to go into that sector, but it didn't work out. We had 2 authorized cultivations of opium, and even one facility was authorized but was never built. So Portugal had a bad experience with opium. Maybe they were too restrictive. And then when in 2014 the first company started to apply for cultivation and production for cannabis, the government had a smarter and more open approach. So the 5 laws that deal with this, it's the 2 normal narcotics laws, and then you have 3 laws on medical cannabis. The law that allows medical cannabis for the domestic market, and then 2, let's say, regulations or minor laws, Decree Law 8 to 19 and Portaria, which is like an ordinance 83 2020 and 21, which in practice what this last ordinance does is, what they do is they put in a law what was being the practice of Infarmed, the regulator dealing with companies that were applying to cultivate and extract cannabis. So we have 6 types of licenses. Mainly production, cultivation is the 2 main licenses. Then you have to have a license to import and export for wholesale. Then there are the industrial hemp license, which is a separate path I'll not cover. And then there's what the industry calls the research license, which is a license to be supplied of medical cannabis, or of cannabis in this case, to perform research. It's not to sell. It's not like in Spain, where we see that the research licenses are being opened up by the regulator, allowing them to sell and export. In Portugal, a research license is a strictly, purely research license. You cannot sell with your research license. The authority to grant the license is Infarmed. Inside Infarmed, there's an Office of Medical Cannabis that consults with other agencies, the CICAD, which is a narcotics agency, the police, the Secret Service, etc., for background checks. And now also the local municipalities have to say if they are against, or if there's anything against the cultivation of cannabis in the area, which is just have to have the municipalities on board, which typically they are because it's investment. So that I heard of, there's no problem at all. Some ideas just to focus. I'm not going to describe the procedure, but these are very precarious titles, and which are only granted at the end of the procedure, meaning you have to make the investment, and only after the investment is the audits, and only after the audits you have the license, which means that you are typically investing and then you don't know if you'll get the license. Of course, if you do things right, you'll get the license. There is no history of denied licenses of applicants that were complying with the requirements, but there's always a risk. This is a way, I believe, that the Portuguese public ecosystem found to create a type of a filter between serious investors and investors that were just like PowerPoint investors. So if you're a real investor, you have to build the walls, build the greenhouses, pay for the security, and then if you are playing it for real, we'll grant you a license. The license is annual. You have to ask for renewals. And so it's a very precarious title in terms of, I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor by training, so I have always to warn clients and friends of this. It's probably the most precarious title that I know in Portuguese law. Precarious meaning that the public authorities have a huge power of revocation without even giving you any type of justification. Well, they have to give some justification, but there's not a selected strict list of justifications. It hasn't happened, but of course investors need to know that. Then of course you have to pass the GACP and GMP test if it's applicable. What we have is 20 cultivation licenses in Portugal now. When I was reviewing my slides, I found that I gave a presentation in 2019. I think it was in Düsseldorf for these same organizers, and there were 4. Now there are 20. So that's the pace and the rhythm. All the licenses are published online. So if you are interested in buying an existing license, make sure you go online and see if it's a real existing license. That's something you should be aware. I think now it's more calm, but some years ago, there was a huge trade in the so-called pre-licenses or even false licenses. So buyer beware, it's listed there. Meet with the regulators before buying, do your due diligence. I'm saying very obvious things, but I've seen mistakes almost happening. And then there are 5, I would say 5 plus 2 production licenses. I would say 5 real production licenses and at least 2 that are not production licenses are labs that want to test cannabis. And the regulator understands that they have to apply through the route of manufacturing and production license. So they don't have an extraction factory. They just have a lab where they can perform tests, analytical tests on cannabis. So I would say there are 5 extraction licenses already issued. So people often ask me, but why? When will I get the license? What's the criteria to? Is there a limit on license? There's nothing of that. Let me just take a glass of water. Sorry. Thank you. I don't want to spar. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, there's no criteria, no cap on licenses. So there's no like 5 licenses. There's no tender, no procurement procedure. The statute to attribute license is very broad. It's the needs of the country, so no one knows what the needs of the country are. Sometimes things slow down. Sometimes they speed up. Clients ask me if it's a de facto standstill, if they are freezing the license. I don't think so. Infarmed is understaffed. They are doing what they can. They had COVID. They had to deal with COVID. They are understaffed in terms of inspectors. So I don't think it's like a policy. Now things are going quick again, but when they go slow, clients and investors think, well, will this be the end of it? I don't think so. I don't have any reason to believe. I think if that happens, I hope not, they will be clear about that. Then the criteria of licenses, is it a first in, first out? Is it the oldest? I think that a persuasive story is very important. You have to have a persuasive story, but a story with investment, with the money where the mouth is. So if you are doing things quick, if Infarmed understands that you are doing the investment, if the story makes sense, both economically and for impact in the country, that I think will in practice means you have a quicker license than the opposite. So that's my experience. Some areas of uncertainty. First, the so-called pre-licenses. When investors and applicants deliver all the paperwork, Infarmed issues a paper where they say that all the documents are okay, then you can proceed. Sometimes I see trade on these pre-licenses. I always advise clients to be very aware that what they may be buying is a few months along the road in terms of investment, in terms of license granting. They are buying nothing. Because Infarmed will always have to make the inspection, so be aware of that. There's no non-enforceability. If then you are not awarded the license, you cannot say, oh, but I had a pre-license. It doesn't give you a legal right. Maybe you can go to court and claim based on legitimate expectations. Courts are very slow in Portugal, first, and second, they give very low compensations in these types of things. So it's like you are losing your money. If they do your work. Sometimes the due diligence to buy a pre-license is as expensive as starting from scratch. So you have that's the thing you have to wait. Sometimes it's a very good pre-license. The guys have done real good work, so you may up saving 3 to 4 months or 5 months. It doesn't matter. Then one area of uncertainty that I'm sure you've discussed in other panels is that at least most of the countries have only legalized medical cannabis, and there's more production than demand. And I don't see as totally unexpected that one day regulators from the countries will say, well, but why are we allowing all these licenses if there are no buyers for all this cannabis? So that's something the industry as a whole have to take in consideration in all countries, not only in Portugal. And then, of course, how will this mix with adult use regulation? Does this mean that when a big and reliable country like Germany allows adult use, will jurisdictions where there's cultivation for medical purpose be allowed to export to the other jurisdiction where they have a non-medical use? And that's an international law problem. That's an international policy problem. It's one of the most interesting. I think there's room in the conventions to allow for that export, provided that it's very controlled and and that the aims of the convention are still met in terms of knowing who is buying what and what quantities, probably a tracking from seed to sale, a mechanism, reporting, voluntary reporting to the NCB. With all those constraints in place, I think that the conventions still allow that a country cultivates for another country that will use it in a non-medical cannabis market, but that's to be seen. That has not happened yet. That has to be seen, and that has to be worked on. The domestic medical market is very short, so we have we did in Portugal, like other countries did, we created a new category of medicines in broad sense. So we have normal medicines like an antibiotic, and then we have medical cannabis. Medical cannabis is subject to a lesser degree of requirements when you want to introduce a product in the market. You don't have to perform like clinical trials like for a normal medicine, but you have to submit a file that is very rigorous, that has lots of regulatory affairs work on it, that's very big. They ask you very questions. You have stabilization, toxicity. You have to include the literature. So it takes time. In Portugal, the law only allows medical cannabis for these conditions. Though these are very strict conditions. Pain is the entry door to most of the prescriptions. But there's a problem. It's probably not of interest of this audience, but there's a problem that in most countries, like in Germany, doctors can prescribe medical cannabis to all, given that it's a subsidiary prescription, but to all conditions. In Portugal, they can only prescribe to those conditions. And they cannot prescribe, this is the important part, on an off-label basis due to a very objective issue, which is when doctors prescribe in Portugal, they have to use an electronic prescribing system. And the electronic prescribing system the doctor has to click on the condition to which he's prescribing. There's no open field or the doctor cannot move from that screen if he doesn't click on the condition to which he is prescribing, which means that if you have anxiety or sleep problems and your doctor is convinced that that's good for you to sleep better, so an off-label prescription of medical cannabis, he cannot do unless he lies and say you have pain or you have Tourette syndrome, which doctors won't do. So it's a restriction on off-label. Then CBD. So you know all this, but in Portugal we have the same problems that CBD in the rest of Europe. So CBD. We have CBD shops. So I'll jump because due to time. So we have CBD shops everywhere, but Portuguese authorities say, which everyone says that, and most people don't like to hear this, but CBD products are, if they are sold as food supplements, they are illegal. Most of the CBD products, if they contain CBD, are illegal, and until we have the result from the European Food Safety Authority. There was news, maybe you know this, but there was so the EFSA asked for a panel to review what's happening in terms of CBD. They delivered their opinion a few days ago. It was made public. And what they say is there's missing information in the CBD applications at the EFSA level, and that the applicants will have to provide more data. I've read the 20 or 30 pages paper that they published. I'm not a doctor or a scientist, so it's very difficult. But from what I read, there's a lot of work to be done. So there's toxicity in the livers, there's toxicity in the sperm count, there's a lot of toxicity that the industry has not provided any explanation or any further studies. So I would say that this will take a long time, a lot of time before CBD will be approved in Europe as a food supplement. This is not so. This is a normal part of the procedure of a novel food application, but the language is really strong in terms of toxicity. When you're trying to authorize a medication, you have safety and efficacy, meaning all medications have secondary effects. But if they treat a condition, you have to outweigh ones with the others. But with food is different. The standard to approve a novel food is food must be safe. You cannot say, oh, CBD is very good, but it enlarged the liver and reduced the sperm count, but it's very good. No, that's the medical route where they do these outweighs. In food, they don't do this. In food, they say, is this safe or is this not safe? And if there are safety issues, they will not issue the authorization. And I think the industry is not very clear about this. Of course, people know that are into the procedure know this, but I unfortunately, I see this. Unfortunately or fortunately, because if this is true, populations should be safe. So this is it's the rules of the game. The Portuguese authorities, they are aligned with this. We have the Economic Activities Agency that's raiding CBD shops and doing some indictments. And the Agriculture Department, which is the department for the hemp licenses, etc., is also very clear that you cannot sell flower, you cannot have the flower blooming if you are doing industrial hemp. Industrial uses are not smoking, are not cosmetics, are not food supplements. That's not industrial use allowed. There was like a 4-hour Q&A with the Ministry of Agriculture a few months ago. They are very, very clear about this. Then people ask, okay, but how come I go to Lisbon and I see the shops that are open? Well, that's probably something that happens all over Europe, but the authorities are very clear on this. The news published last month said that one owner of CBD shops was acquitted from the narcotics indictments that he had. So, which is probably means that the courts will look at this differently from you just selling cannabis illegally. But nevertheless, it's you are put into a criminal procedure that you have to defend yourself from. Many of these CBD shops and CBD products have medical claims, purely medical claims, the websites. So the claims are purely medical, which always also and I'm a lawyer, I have to say this, which also brings, once we have medical cannabis, brings the possibility of accusations under the Falsified Medicines Act, which is another thing to take in consideration. Then I'm reaching the 30 minutes. What do I think are the prospects of adult use regulation in Portugal? So we had an election in January, the end of January. The Socialist Party, which is typically a liberal party in terms of drug use, they did the decriminalization reform in 2000. The current prime minister was one of the ministers of justice in that government that decriminalized personal use of all drugs in 2000 until a quantity limit. The Socialist Youth, which is the young arm of the Socialist Party, they are very pro-cannabis, and we have for the first time 4 small parties that won election that had MPs elected. We have 4 out of 7 that have a pro-cannabis agenda explicitly in their programs when they run. So I think we have the most favorable cannabis parliaments since ever. the anti-cannabis parties, they were either expelled of the parliament by vote, the Christian Democrats and the communists, which are very against cannabis in Portugal. They reduced their presence in the parliament a lot. And we have a far-right party which is against cannabis, which is very good. Then maybe all the other parties will unite against the far-right in the cannabis agenda. So I think it's very useful for the cannabis agenda. Because one thing is the Communist Party or the Christian Democrats that everybody respects. They have been part of the Portuguese democracy. Now this new right-wing majority is good that they are anti-cannabis, so they can be hated. So I think it will be good for cannabis. Bloc de Esquerda... and we have an economic crisis, as you all know, as we all have, due to COVID and post-COVID, and we have an installed capacity in the country. So maybe politicians will think, well, since we have all this cannabis, we are one of the... Portugal consumes a lot of cannabis. The estimates are 400,000 yearly users. We are top on the heavy users. Which is something that's not good, but we are heavy on heavy users. I think that tourism also plays a role in that. So we have high consumption of cannabis per capita, not like France, but a lot. I don't know what role visitors play in the cannabis consumption in the Portuguese market. One thing that Portugal doesn't want is to have all the tourism and then become a cannabis tourism destination. I try to, when I give conferences or speeches, I try to demystify that. We have cocktails sold at €3 in Lisbon, so we are already a narcotics heaven for tourism. We have the cheapest alcohol in Europe, so I don't. That's how I try to combat this idea that we'll become a heaven for cannabis. We are already a heaven for people that want to have fun. So, and we are not doing nothing against that. So, why not own it? The three challenges to this happening is that, like Bloc de Esquerda, the left-wing party just introduced a bill. They want to claim their cannabis agenda, so they did not discoordinate it with the majority party. So now we have in Parliament since 2 or 3 days ago, a normal bill to allow adult use, which has both a legal business licensed stores and self-cultivation. Everybody in Portugal assumes that self-cultivation will never be approved, so it's like a trade-off in all laws. You put self-cultivation so you can bargain with something and leave self-cultivation for a second wave. Because in Portugal, although the drug possession is decriminalized, cannabis cultivation is still a crime. So there's this thing in the law. Portugal did not decriminalize the cultivation of cannabis. It's explicitly prohibited. You can cultivate opium poppy in your garden, but you cannot cultivate cannabis. But that's the law. The second challenge is we have a conservative president, and all the bills must be signed by the president. He can either veto or send to the Constitutional Court. So that's even if the parliament is totally pro-cannabis, there's like this last hurdle. And then, of course, there's the UN conventions and the global supply chain that I have referred to, and how will these all fit into place. The Secretary General of the United Nations was the Portuguese Prime Minister that decriminalized drugs in 2000, António Guterres. So he's very aware of liberal drug policies. He was very forward-looking when he was a Prime Minister, and I know he's very worried always with this drug problem in the world. And I believe that human rights should be included in the UN conventions as an interpretive tool, and that UN conventions will allow for this. And how we solve a global supply chain problem. When Germany decriminalized, where is that cannabis going to come from? More and more countries will decriminalize. How will we have a supply chain that's efficient for consumers, efficient for companies, and is more in accordance with the UN conventions? That's for me the challenge we all should be thinking of, that will solve probably a problem and will not make of the cannabis, legalized adult use cannabis sector, something that's like a monster where inefficient reigns, where the crime and the black market and illicit market still operate. So it has to be think from the beginning. So that's the things I wanted to address. I'll be in the Q&A if you have any questions. Thank you.